Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to MusicForever, where today I'm bringing you guys a brand new catch-up review video where I'm going to be talking about and briefly reviewing several projects released this year that I didn't have a chance to give full reviews to for one reason or another. It's been a pretty busy year for me personally. I mean, the first, 4 or 5 months of the year, I put out one video aside from my year-end list from last year just because of how busy I was. So I haven't had time to cover all the albums I've really wanted to in full here on the channel. Instead, I've really been focusing on just a select few and really going all into those reviews that I do have the time to do. But I do still want to talk about some of those other releases. I just don't want to not talk about them at any point. So that's the purpose of a video like this, where I quickly and to the best of my ability try to succinctly explain my thoughts on some other projects released this year that I happen to have some strong opinions on one way or another. So yeah, I'm going to be going through this video from project to project. I'm going to be going in order of release for this video in terms of the order, with the exception of projects released by the same artist, which I'll just talk about all together around the time that the first project they dropped in the year happened to come out, just because I think that makes the most sense. And also, this isn't the only projects from earlier this year that I wanted to cover in a video like this. In fact, this is only going to be about half of it, honestly. I was planning on having 20-something projects in this video, but I got a good amount of the way into filming my reviews for the actual albums themselves, and I realized this video would have been way too freaking long if I did that. So instead, I'm breaking it up into two videos instead. The first one is the one you're watching right now. The next one will be coming out hopefully within a few weeks' time. It's basically going to be me covering more albums from this year that I just didn't have a chance to cover here in this video. There's no difference between the albums in each video. The fact that one appears here and not in the other one is completely arbitrary. So yeah, I think I've already gone on way too long for this intro, but basically, yeah, quick little reviews here today. Obviously not my full detailed thoughts because I don't have the time to do that here in this video, but I'm going to try my hardest to keep things as clear and succinct and detailed as I can while also being, really brief with my thoughts. So yeah, let's get started with the first project I want to talk about here today. First project I'm talking about is Fax Gang's newest release, Aethernet. This is an album that some of you will probably expect to see in this video, given that I actually showcased a CD copy of this record I purchased in my last CD and vinyl collection update video. And obviously, considering the fact that I happened to buy a physical copy of this thing, obviously I really liked this album if I was willing to do that. And yes, I do really like this album. It's one of my favorites of the year so far. The sound of this record is this really interesting, super cloudy version of cloud rap that I just find super interesting and intoxicating. Like, the vocals here across this thing are distorted to the point of being unintelligible across many moments across the songs on this project, but in a way that I think really works with the feel of this project. I mean, sure, you're definitely going to have to read along with the lyrics if you want to understand everything that's going on in them as you listen to this thing, but I really love how the vocals here on this project are used like an instrument in order to create some really sticky and memorable melodies across these tracks. And they're paired up really nicely with all the instrumentals on this thing too, which are similarly super distorted and cloudy, and the atmosphere here on this record is just excellent. I'm in love with just how cloudy and hazy it all is. And I also love how, a lot of the tracks on this thing still manage to sound super diverse and interesting while feeling very focused under this super cloudy sound. You'll have your more straightforward banging tracks like Shotgun. You'll have more atmospheric cuts on this thing like Mirror. The song Implosion is a super interesting one because I feel like, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I feel like the instrumental of this track is almost like rock influenced, like this really noisy, cloudy rock instrumental. I don't know. It's super interesting. I think it works within the context of this record really nicely. And I just love how this artist is able to have so much variety here on this project, but at the same time, they're able to make it sound really focused too. Yeah, overall, this is a project that I don't think will necessarily be for everyone because of just how cloudy and distorted it all is, but come into this thing with an open mind, or, if you're into this kind of super cloudy hip-hop already, maybe you don't need to come into this thing necessarily with a super open mind, but definitely check this thing out for sure, because it's a really great project. It's one that I've been coming back to over and over again since I first heard it several months ago, and yeah, it's one of my favorites of the year so far. I bought it on CD, like I said before, and obviously I only pay for records for physical copies, CDs, vinyl, whatever it is, if I happen to really like it. So that should be that should really speak to how much I enjoyed this record, that I was willing to go out of my way to purchase a physical copy of this thing. So yeah, definitely check this out. The next project I'm going to be talking about is this new project, Planetary Destruction, from Doc D, which is this alias of Logic, who has come out of retirement recently after entering his retirement last year, in order to drop this mixtape here, which kind of serves as a tribute project of sorts to the late MF Doom, who passed away last year, an artist that I feel like doesn't really need much introduction, so I won't waste your time with it here. But yeah, this is basically Logic doing a bit of a tribute to Doom, and really here on this thing, he does a decent job, I guess, at copying some of Doom's traits into this thing. Of course, he's playing this like evil character on this thing, much like Doom did. A lot of the lyrics here on this thing are filled with various pop culture references, especially like nerdy bits of pop culture. He has this like deep voice thing going on that's obviously artificial, that's kind of meant to, I guess, mimic Doom's really deep voice as well. He gets a lot of the surface level things here on this project right to some extent. However, I didn't really find myself enjoying this mixtape as a whole because I feel like it doesn't really get at some of the deeper things I think Doom was able to get right in his music. You know, it doesn't have the really fantastic rhymes and wordplay. It doesn't really have, you know, what Doom did with his music and taking that like evil persona and making really interesting concepts around it. It feels very surface level here on this thing, and I guess to some extent that's to be expected because obviously Logic isn't Doom, and I don't expect him to, you know, make a Doom project like exactly what one would sound like here on this thing. But still, the end result here is just not that interesting in my opinion. And especially because the villainous character that he's playing here on this thing oftentimes feels a lot more whiny than like villainous, which I suppose isn't like the worst thing in the world if it's going to be framed a certain way, but the framing here just didn't really back it up in a super interesting way in my opinion. And the skits across this thing are also super grating too for the most part. A lot of times trying to inject some narrative and humor into this record, but, you know, yeah, there is some narrative that it provides, I guess, but the humor doesn't really hit for the most part. It's just kind of boring, kind of grating. The instrumentals here on this project, I will say though, are probably the one part of this thing that I actually thought were pretty decent for the most part. I think the instrumentals here are pretty okay. It's not good enough that it would make me want to come back to this record in spite of all the other things I don't care for, but you know, the instrumentals, they're kind of interesting. There's something here to them that I think could have been more interesting in a different context. You know, Logic's rapping here is fine for the most part. I think he's a fine rapper on a technical sense, but you know, this is just kind of an uninteresting project in my opinion. Again, he gets a lot of the surface level stuff about Doom right here, but I don't really think he gets at a lot of the deeper stuff that made Doom a legend as opposed to just, you know, some other rapper. And, you know, for I guess a tribute project like this, I suppose it's not the absolute worst thing that there is, but, you know, only check this out if you're like a hardcore Logic fan, because I think it's the only demographic of people that are really going to get much out of this thing. If not, it probably won't interest you all that much, even if you are really into Doom in his music. The next project I'm going to be talking about is yet another release from Logic this year, his third edition to his Bobby Tarantino series of mixtapes. And this is a project that, you know, if you've heard the previous two mixtapes in this series, I think you have a pretty fair idea of what to expect from this one, because stylistically, it's pretty much more of the same. You know, on this thing, much like on the previous two, Logic is going for more straightforward songs here. The beats here on this thing have more of a trap influence to them. Lyrically, these aren't like the most complex, you know, songs from like a thematic standpoint or anything like that. It's pretty straightforward, fun tracks for the most part that are meant to be really enjoyed by like his hardcore fans for the most part. And with the first two mixtapes in this series, I wasn't exactly thrilled with them. I thought that they were pretty average overall, perfectly listenable for the most part, but not all that memorable. And for the most part, I feel similarly about this one, for much of the same reasons that I felt about those previous two tapes. Logic's rapping here on this thing, you know, like on the previous project of his I was talking about, is technically pretty fine, though it's not exactly like the most interesting or anything like that. Lyrically, it's not a super interesting project either. There are some points on this thing that do raise some little bits and pieces of interesting information, about logics of mental health and things like that, but they don't really, dig into it enough, I feel, to really be super interesting, especially when compared to maybe some of his better tracks in the past. And, there's just not that much going on here, I feel, that I can find myself coming back to over and over again. One thing where I think this album diverges from the previous two in this series is that I feel like the production here on this thing is also kind of weak here on this thing too. If I remember correctly, I believe that on the previous two mixtapes in this series, I felt like the production was one of the stronger points on those two. And I'd say that it was like amazing overall or anything, but I thought it was pretty solid. But here, a lot of the beats on this thing sound kind of bland, kind of forgettable, not all that interesting. I mean, they're not awful, but they're just not all that exciting either. And when paired with everything else that's going on here, it just leads to this mixtape feeling pretty forgettable and uninteresting overall. Probably my least favorite of these three tapes in this series. But overall, when it comes to like recommending this tape to someone, I'd say if you like the previous two in this series, you're gonna like this one. If you didn't like the previous two, you won't like this one either. It's pretty much exactly what you would expect from Bobby Tarantino 3. And, that's probably just the most concise way I could put a recommendation for this project, for better or for worse. The next project I'm going to be talking about is 30 and 35 by James Paddock, probably better known as Jimmy in the Doom fan community, probably best known for the many music tracks that he's made for a variety of different Doom fan games, fan maps, things like that, as well as his own maps and things like that too. He's pretty well known in that regard, and I really like his music. I really love his tracks, and that's why I checked this out too. This is the 5th installment in his 30 and 30 series, where he's got 30 tracks here pretty much on this album that he has released, and overall it's basically 30 Doom MIDI tracks. I don't believe any of these have actually been used in any like fan content yet, but I can certainly see any of these tracks fitting in really nicely with a variety of different styles of Doom levels and things like that. I really love the sound of this thing overall from start to finish. You get a good amount of variety here on this thing. Some energetic, hard-rocking tracks that are going to fill you with adrenaline. You have some more atmospheric cuts on this thing too that sound really beautiful. You just get a good variety here on this thing. Overall, I would say this album is kind of compilation-like in nature, given that every track here kind of has its own thing going for it. And with 30 tracks here on this thing, it's a pretty lengthy listen from start to finish. And I feel like that, mixed with the fact that this is kind of a niche release, given that it's, basically Doom fan community-esque songs, this might not necessarily appeal to everyone out there. However, I think for that particular niche of people who do enjoy Doom fan content and especially like the music associated with that, I think that this is a release that is most certainly worth checking out. Jimmy's a pretty legendary figure in this community when it comes to his music, and I think that this release here is a pretty good representation of why, because across these 30 tracks, he's really just putting great track after great track here on this thing. And despite this project's really lengthy runtime, I found myself engaged from start to finish here on this thing, mostly because every song here has a distinct identity to it and overall just sounds really great. Yeah, overall, again, I don't think this is a release that'll necessarily appeal to everyone out there, but it's a pretty great one still in my opinion. If you happen to like this particular style of music, Doom, MIDIs, then I think you will enjoy this release because it's overall just a great collection of songs from start to finish. Also, I'd love to see some of these tracks used in people's fan-made levels, or maybe if they already have been used and I just don't know about it, feel free to leave whatever the name of the level is in the comment section down below, because I'd love to check it out. But yeah, this is some great stuff overall. For the next record I'm going to be talking about, let's stay on the topic of Doom and Doom fan music for a little bit, because I'm going to be talking about this newest MegaSphere album, the Master Levels for Doom 2 25th Anniversary MIDI Pack. This is a fan collection of tracks, mostly composed by MegaSphere, also with a few guest artists featured on this thing as well. It's made to accompany the Doom 2 Master Levels, which, a little bit of history here for those who are maybe unaware. The Master Levels for Doom 2 were a set of levels released back after the release of Doom 2, back in the 90s, and they're a set of levels that within the Doom community aren't exactly known for being the highest quality. They're generally not the most beloved. And one thing about them that people don't really care for is that the soundtrack is, well, kind of non-existent, I guess. There is a soundtrack technically, but it just reuses songs from the original Doom games instead of having its own original soundtrack. And this particular soundtrack seems to want to fix that to some extent, to give the master levels their own unique set of songs. And that's a pretty interesting idea in my opinion, even if the master levels aren't exactly the most beloved set of levels out there. It's still kind of interesting now to have a set of original songs to go along with them, even if they are, even if it is a fan-made collection of tracks. The Doom community puts out fantastic fan-made content all the time, so don't let the fan-made aspect of things scare you away. If you are maybe a more casual Doom fan, you're just unaware of that side of the Doom community, because there's a ton of interesting stuff coming out of there, whether it be fan-made levels or music or things like that. Obviously today we're talking about the music here with this soundtrack, and it's one that is really enjoyable in my opinion. Not only really enjoyable, but also really unique too. It's an album that has a really playful vibe to it with its tracks. Like, I almost feel like it's almost aware to some extent that the levels that it's accompanying just aren't necessarily the best in quality. I mean, some of the titles of these tracks are kind of jokey in nature, kind of alluding to some of the faults within these maps to some extent, or at least what lots of people see as faults in these maps. And I feel like the sound of the music has this kind of playful, fun feel to it to go along with it. Like I said, almost as if it's kind of aware that it's playing the role of a soundtrack to a collection of levels that isn't necessarily the greatest, but it's still trying its hardest to sound as good as it can be. And I think stylistically it's also really interesting too, because of course you have some of those genres that you typically would expect to be paired with some Doom levels, some songs that have influence from blues and metal and rock music. But there's also some really interesting genre influences on some of the tracks here too. Some jazz influence on some of these songs, some trap influence on some of these songs too. Some sounds that just aren't all that common to hear in Doom MIDIs, but they're incorporated into some of the tracks here on this collection of songs, and I think it works out really nicely. Some of these instrumentals end up sounding really unique because of it too. And when you take into account that, with how nicely together a lot of these compositions are, with the really fun, playful nature of all these songs, and you get a really fantastic soundtrack for a not-so-fantastic collection of levels. And, you know, the Doom 2 Master levels, I can't necessarily say I recommend them for those of you out there to play. At the very least, make sure you play the original couple of games first, because those are much better. But, you know, if you are going to check out the Master levels, do so with this soundtrack, because it definitely makes the experience a bit more enjoyable. At least the soundtrack is really great, if you know, even if the rest of the level necessarily isn't. And even if you're not interested in checking out the master levels, either because you just don't want to play through some not so great levels, or maybe you're just not even familiar at all with anything Doom related, and the whole time I've been talking about this, you're just like, JG, what the hell are you talking about? This is still an album I think that is worth checking out if you're into, you know, some interesting kind of quirky electronic music that's a bit reminiscent of like a 90s video game soundtrack, because this still has a lot to offer, I feel, with its variety and its very fun, playful nature. I think, you know, people can get a lot of enjoyment out of this even if they're not necessarily interested in checking out the master levels, which, again, can't blame you if you're not interested in that, because the levels aren't that great, at least in my opinion and in the opinion of many other people out there. But yeah, this is a great soundtrack, one I highly recommend, especially if you're a fan of this kind of music. The newest record from the Foo Fighters, Medicine at Midnight, is the next product that I want to talk about. The Foo Fighters are one of my favorite bands, but I did have, you know, a good amount of hesitation or fear, I guess, coming into this project, because the last decade or so of this band's career just hasn't been the most interesting, in my opinion. I feel like their last couple of releases, you know, full-length albums, Sonic Highways and Concrete and Gold, had some interesting ideas, each respectively, but I don't really think they completely, you know, took advantage of a lot of those really interesting ideas. You know, Sonic Highways had the whole various cities in America concept going for it, but I didn't really feel like any of the songs explored it all that interesting in their sounds. Concrete and Gold had a lot of really interesting bells and whistles on a variety of the songs on it, but I felt like they didn't really add all that much to the end product, and that album, for the most part, ended up sounding like a pretty typical Foo Fighters record. And unfortunately, I feel like this newest release from the band is, another pretty typical Foo Fighters record, pretty much from start to finish. And I like the typical Foo Fighters sound. This is one of my favorite bands for a reason. I like their sound, but I'm kind of tired of it at this point. And yeah, they could perform it pretty nicely, and many of the tracks on this record still demonstrate that, but it's just not that exciting to me at this point. The only track on this thing I found myself enjoying was Shame Shame, because it is a song that does things a little bit differently. I like the really restrained yet tense atmosphere that the track has going for it. I like Grohl's vocals on the track, especially during the hook of the song. It's not like a ridiculously different song by Foo Fighters standards or anything like that, but it's just different enough to keep me interested. And I feel like I'll definitely return to this individual song in the future. But everything else here on the record, not really. I mean, it's not to say some of the other tracks here don't have interesting qualities to them. I think the opener to the record, Making a Fire, is this really nice, energetic track that, in the context of the record, is kind of, fun to listen to. But I do feel like there's other songs in the band's catalog that do what this song is doing, but better. I also think the track Waiting on a War has a bit of an interesting lyrical idea going for it, where Grohl's basically kind of comparing his own upbringing and the troubles in the world at that time to what, modern kids have to go through in the world. It's an interesting idea on paper, I feel, but the actual execution here on this record leaves a little bit to be desired, in my opinion. I didn't really find the lyrics to the track to be all that interesting or insightful, despite the fact that I felt like the concept of the song was pretty interesting. So yeah, it is one of the more interesting songs on the record just for having a kind of interesting concept alone, but even then, the actual song itself isn't anything all that special, I feel. Unfortunately, I just feel like Medicine at Midnight is another, typical Foo Fighters record, unfortunately. And again, it's not the absolute worst thing in the world, because I do like this sound that the band has made for themselves over the year. I still think that they perform it decently enough. And they do have, a variety here in their sound. They have their more energetic rocking songs. They have some slower cuts on this thing. There's a decent amount of variety here, and the album isn't, super long. It's pretty to the point, honestly, and I do appreciate about it, but it doesn't still save the fact that this is just a pretty bland, typical record from them overall, and that's kind of unfortunate because, again, I am a big fan of these guys and their music, and while I didn't really find their last couple of full-length releases to be some of the most interesting in their catalog, I do think that they still showcase that this band can make really interesting songs if they want to. Both of those records had some tracks on them that I did really like. The Saint Cecilia EP they put out in 2015 was really great. And even, a track like Shame Shame on this thing shows that the band can do interesting stuff still, but they're just not for whatever reason. And, it's unfortunate, but yeah, this is just a kind of average record in my opinion. Next up, I'm going to be talking about the newest record from Hayley Williams. This is her second studio album on her own outside of Paramore, the group she's obviously most well known for being a part of. And I felt like the debut record that she put out on her own last year, Petals for Armor, was a pretty interesting and enjoyable release. It wasn't one of my favorite albums overall of last year, but I did enjoy it quite a bit. And I really appreciated the fact that Williams spent a lot of time on that record exploring some sounds that she hadn't been able to explore previously with Paramore, and I just found it to be a super interesting release from that perspective, and I was excited to see what she was going to do going forward, whether it would be with Paramore or on her own still. And it seems like she's decided to put out another record on her own, and this is another pretty interesting project from her, because while Petals for Armor was a project that saw her exploring a lot of different sounds and ideas across its runtime, this is a very focused project with everything here really having this more stripped back, indie folk sound to it. And I think it's pretty interesting that she decided to completely switch things up in that regard. And it's a pretty interesting bit of artistic development there. And while I do really respect this record from that standpoint of things, I personally just did not find this record to be really interesting at all. I felt like the instrumentals here on this thing, while competently put together, just aren't the most interesting or well put together. They're just kind of bland for the most part. The same could be kind of said about the vocals here on this thing, which is a bit odd to me because I've always felt like Williams has been a really interesting and unique vocalist in the past, but I feel like the delivery here on this release is just really bland for whatever reason and just lacks any of the character that was so prominent in all of her vocal performances prior to this one. It's odd. It just feels like the life has just been completely sucked out of her voice on the majority of the songs on this thing, and it just leaves a lot of these songs feeling a bit flat. The hooks here on this record could also be kind of annoying at points too, especially with how repetitive they could be. And I'm not against repetition in songs or anything like that. It certainly has a time and place where it could really work, but I feel like with the really stripped back and simple approach to a lot of the songwriting here on this thing, it just leaves a lot of the hooks on this thing feeling kind of simple to the point of being a bit boring, and yeah, it just does not add to this record in a really great way in my opinion. The only thing about this record that I did really like was the lyrics here on this thing. I've always appreciated Williams' lyrics in the past for the most part, and I feel like this project here also has some more solid lyrics to go along with it. It doesn't feel like she's faltered on that front of things here on this record, in spite of everything else really not working for me personally. However, while I do really appreciate the lyrics here on this project, they're not really enough to make up for everything else that's going on here and make the album a worthwhile listen. For me personally, I think a lot of other people will certainly get more out of this record than I did. I think this is certainly one of those cases where this particular mixture of elements here on this project just did not click with me personally, and I do respect this record from an artistic standpoint, seeing Williams explore something new in this sound. It's just, overall this record was not for me, I guess. I'm still excited to see, though, where she's going to go after this with Paramore, or maybe again on her own. Yeah, this wasn't for me, but I think it certainly will be for some other people. So if you're just really interested in seeing Williams do this really stripped back style of like indie folk and indie pop, give this a listen, I guess. You might get something out of it more worthwhile than what I did. The next project I'm going to be talking about is the first record that King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard dropped this year, LW. This is a project that serves, I guess, as a sequel release to the record KG that the group dropped towards the end of last year. If you saw me talk about that record, I believe it was in my last catch-up review towards the end of last year, I thought it was a pretty okay project, but it didn't really wow me or anything like that. I felt like all the performances on it were pretty fine. There were some standout tracks that I could see myself coming back to, but for the most part, it just didn't really interest me all that much. And that's very much the case for the most part with LW as well. The band here are still doing the kind of psychedelic Anatolian influenced sound here, and it is a sound that I think the band pulls off pretty nicely, much like on KG. However, again, I just don't really find myself all that intrigued by the particular set of songs that the band is doing here. Don't really find any of the tracks to be particularly catchy. I don't really find any of the songs to be all that interestingly structured or anything like that. Don't find any of the riffs to be all that memorable, any of the lyrics to be all that memorable. It's just an okay listening experience, I guess. It's a record that, when I hear it, it's fine, it doesn't really bother me, but I'm not going to seek it out to return to it in the future or anything like that. And I think when compared to KG, this record does lack some of the highlights that that album had. There were a few songs on that record I could see myself coming back to in the future, even if I wasn't wowed by the whole product. However, here, I don't really think that there are any big highlights on this thing to come back to, and because of that, I think it is a little weaker than KG, even if overall it's a pretty similar experience. Yeah, this is a pretty average record in my opinion. I think if you're a big fan of these guys and you just happen to really like this particular sound that they occasionally do, especially if you really like KG, I think you'll really like this record as well, because it's more of the same thing pretty much. But for me personally, I don't think I'm going to be returning to this one in the future. The next album I'm going to talk about is the second album from King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, released this year, Butterfly 3000. This is actually a release that I found myself enjoying quite a bit more than the other album they dropped this year, and even KG that dropped last year too. Stylistically, this record sees the band exploring psychedelic rock and psychedelic pop, some ideas that aren't exactly new to the band. The band has always played around with various styles of psychedelic music on previous releases, and I feel like this here isn't exactly like the most fresh or new thing coming from them, but it manages to work enough in my opinion, mostly because I feel like the songwriting here is a bit stronger when compared to the last couple of releases. I think the hooks here on this record are a lot catchier and a lot more memorable. I think some of the atmosphere here on this thing, the psychedelic feel of this record, is one that's pretty consistent. It's one that's pretty easy to get lost in and get invested in. And overall, it just leads to this record being a pretty fun listening experience. I'm not going to say this is like the best record from this band's catalog or anything like that, not their most forward-thinking or anything along those lines. But I think it ends up being enjoyable enough, mostly because, like I said before, enough of the compositions here just end up being interesting enough for me to find myself wanting to listen to this again on occasion if I happen to be in the mood for something kind of psychedelic and poppy. I think that this record gets the job done pretty nicely. And if you're a fan of this band, particularly their more psychedelic leaning stuff, or just a fan of that kind of music in general, then this is a record that's certainly worth giving a listen to. Again, I don't think it's one that's necessarily going to blow your mind or anything like that, but for what it's worth, it's pretty enjoyable in my opinion. Next, I'm going to be talking about the newest record from Xiu Xiu, Oh No. This was a project that I was looking forward to quite a bit, considering Xiu Xiu's a band I really like, and I especially like their last full-length record that they dropped in 2019 too. That was one of my favorites in their catalog. So I was excited to see where they were going to go from there. And it seems like yet again they decided to do something completely different with their next release. It seems like the big idea behind this record here is that pretty much every track here on this thing sees the group collaborating with a different artist to make a track. And while this is the kind of idea that seems interesting but could maybe lead to disaster if, the collaborations aren't super consistent, Oh No is fortunately a record where I feel like all the collaborations end up working to this record's benefit. And I think all the artists involved here do a good job at melding what they bring to these tracks with a variety of different sounds and ideas that Xiu Xiu explored in the past and been able to pull off really well in the past. This still does feel, at the end of the day, like a Xiu Xiu record. It has a lot of qualities to it that the group has explored in previous releases of theirs. You'll have tracks on this thing that are a bit more slow, like the opener, for example, which also has this very tense atmosphere to it that the band has certainly explored before in the past, but I still love in the context of this project too. You'll have tracks on this thing like 100 Years, which sees the group embracing a bit more of a noisy sound. You'll have tracks like Rumpus Room, which has a bit of an oddball nature that's not all too different from some of the ideas that were present on that last full-length release of theirs from 2019. This is a record that, despite the fact that it sees the group covering a decent amount of ground stylistically, it's a lot of different sounds and ideas that the band has, to some extent, played around with in the past. And I just really am impressed with how nicely all these features managed to blend into the band's sound on these songs to make tracks that still feel like Xiu Xiu tracks, but at the same time definitely feel like collaborations that are taking inspiration and sounds from the artists that are being featured on these songs. If there are any complaints I have with this record, it's just that the flow of this thing isn't, the greatest in my opinion. It's not like bad necessarily in my opinion either. I feel like all the songs on this thing, as they're sequenced, the track sequence is fine, but I feel like it could be a bit better, and as it is right now, this album almost gives me a bit of like a compilation vibe with how it's put together, like maybe a compilation of tracks from like the same era of a band's career, in the sense that all the songs sound similar, like they're from the same period of time and stuff, and they make sense together, but there's not all that much going on when it comes to the transition from track to track here on this thing, and it just kind of feels like I'm getting song after song here, and it's not the worst thing in the world, fortunately, because again, the songs themselves all sound like they belong together, and of course the quality of the songs themselves is really high too, so it's not that big of an issue, but it is something I noticed while listening to this thing, that this does have this almost like compilation-like feel to it at times. Maybe it's because of all the artists involved in the making of this project that ended up being the case, but if that's the only downside to having so many hands involved in making this record, and the fact that the group was able to pull off what they were able to pull off here, having this record be a collaborative effort with a bunch of different artists while still having it be very clearly an album that fits the band's core sound, then I think it's a pretty worthwhile fault to have here, because overall Oh No ended up being a record that I really enjoyed. Another great record from these guys. I wouldn't say it's like the absolute top tier of Xiu Xiu's best releases, but it's still a really great release that's worth your time for sure. Next, I'm going to be talking about the newest album from Weezer, Van Weezer. This is an album that I have been very interested to hear, not necessarily because I was super excited for a new Weezer release, but just because of the background behind this release, with it being announced like in September, I believe it was, of 2019, set to be released in May of 2020. getting delayed because of the pandemic and all that to May of this year. Instead, it was just a really interesting ride to follow leading up to the release of this record. And now that it's here, it's not that interesting of a project in my opinion. Much like the last few releases from this band, it just feels like another kind of like half-hearted Weezer release. You know, the band here on this thing is doing something a little bit different, exploring like this hard rock, arena rock sound. And, you know, the record definitely has that sound to it, but I feel like the band approaches it in this very surface level way, where it feels like this coat of paint over the band's core sound that's meant to give this record like a bit of a personality to it, because there's just not that much else going on to it outside of that. The thing is, when you look past the very surface level personality this record has, there's not much interesting going on here, nothing all too different from what Weezer has been doing through their last few releases. The instrumentals are pretty bland and by the numbers, the vocal performances are not some of the band's best, and the lyrics are just not that interesting, borderline silly at points too, and not really in the good, endearing kind of way, more of the kind of lazy, half-hearted sort of way. And, you know, it's just not that interesting of a release from these guys. And the kind of unfortunate thing is that it even seems weaker, I feel, because it kind of feels like Weezer already made this kind of record better several years ago with their record Maladroit, which came out like almost 2 decades ago at this point. Well, I don't think that's like a great record or anything. I have quite a few problems with that record as well, but I feel like that project did a better job at melding like this sort of hard rock sound with Weezer's core sound in a way that felt natural, and was able to produce a project that still felt really Weezer, but clearly had a bit of a unique sound going for it. Whereas this project, it feels like Weezer in their, you know, current modern day state, just with this like hard arena rock coat of paint on top of it, which just isn't all that interesting to me. So yeah, this record was just really forgettable in my opinion. Just nothing to it that really stood out to me as all that good or interesting or worth coming back to. The only thing that really stood out to me were some of the, you know, bad lyrics here or there on this thing. Some other odd choices, like that one song that, you know, uses the riff from Ozzy Osbourne's Crazy Train. And I'm sure the band got permission to do that, obviously, but it's just such a weird choice, because what was the purpose of doing that? It didn't really make the song better. It didn't really fit thematically in with the song or anything like that. They just used the riff from Crazy Train because people recognize it as a popular riff, I guess, and it works with the hard rock sound of this record, I suppose. And it's recognizable, I guess. That's why they used it. It doesn't really add to the record outside of that fact. And it doesn't sound as good here on this thing as it sounds on the original song, and it just leaves the track it appears on feeling so odd and half-hearted. Yeah, I did not care for Van Weezer personally. It's not awful. It's mostly listenable, but it's just really bland and forgettable, and I would not recommend it if you haven't enjoyed what Weezer have been doing on their past few releases, because a lot of the flaws on those past few releases are here on this thing as well, and they just really drag this thing down. The next record that I'm going to be talking about is the newest collaborative album between Czarface and MF Doom. This was a record I was looking forward to quite a bit, considering that the last collaborative record between these two artists was one that I thought was pretty solid overall, probably one of the better releases from both of these artists in recent memory. So I was hoping that this project would also be a pretty enjoyable experience. And not only that, but this was the first material from Doom being dropped since his passing. And typically I'm not a big fan of material released after an artist's death. However, apparently he was working on this record prior to his passing, and, you know, it was just put together after his passing and released now. So, you know, this was like the real deal, not just stuff from the vault being slapped onto these Czarface tracks, real stuff that he was actually working on. So I was hoping that this was going to be, you know, at least as good as that last collaborative record between these two acts. And overall, that's not quite the case in my opinion. I wouldn't say this is a bad record, but it's not really one that I enjoyed either. I think it's pretty average overall. Doom doesn't really appear on this thing as much as I was hoping. He feels kind of lacking in terms of presence on this thing, and maybe that's because of his passing and he just didn't have time to get as much done here for this thing as was initially expected of him. But yeah, I found that to be a little bit disappointing. I actually don't think his performances here on this thing are among his best. Not to say that they're bad, but they're just pretty okay by his own standards. Czarface, in the case of that act, it's pretty much the same here as well. The performances are technically pretty fine, but they're nothing all that special, nothing that I haven't heard from Czarface in the past. The instrumentals are pretty fine. The flows are pretty fine too. The lyrics are still chock full of pop culture nerd references that you would expect from both of these acts, but not in a way that I think is super interesting or new or innovative or anything like that. Overall, this is just kind of an average collaborative project between these two acts. It feels very lightweight in terms of what it delivers, while that last collaborative record felt like it really put some life back into these two acts by seeing them collaborate together and do something a bit different with that. This just kind of feels almost like some leftovers being slapped together from both artists, and it's a little bit disappointing because of that, and also because, like I mentioned before, this is the first release from Doom since his passing, and I was hoping for maybe a little bit better from him in that regard. But I guess I can't really be too hard on it because obviously he passed away. I guess didn't have time to see this project through to its conclusion, and obviously I can't blame him or anyone else involved with this project for that, because that wouldn't make any sense. But yeah, overall I feel like this was pretty average. I'd only really check it out if you're a massive fan of either of these artists, because in that case maybe you will get some more enjoyment out of it. But for me personally, I thought it was kind of mediocre. I probably won't be returning to it going forward. Next up, I'm going to be talking about the newest album from Panopticon, and again, Into the Light. Panopticon is one of my favorite acts in metal currently, probably just one of my favorite acts in music in general currently, just because I love this project's really unique take on black metal, mixing a style of atmospheric black metal with Americana and folk music to make a sound that is truly this project's own. And I just love that aspect of this project, and I was looking forward to a really new album from it because of that, and this newest one here does not disappoint in my opinion, mostly because this record just continues to display that signature Panopticon sound on full display here. It sounds excellent. I love the really cold atmosphere here on this thing. I love the instrumentals here on this thing, whether they be some of the colder, harsher sounding black metal styled instrumentals or some of the more serene sounding folk ones on this thing too. The vocals here are fantastic as well. Again, whether it be those more vicious black metal shrieks or some of the more sung moments on this thing, they all sound fantastic. You do even have a little bit of a post-metal influence, I feel, creep into some aspects of this record, which is something that isn't entirely new for Panopticon, but I think it's used sparingly here on this project to great effect. Overall, this is just yet another fantastic record from Panopticon. I love the atmosphere here on this thing. I love the performances. Really the only complaint I might have with it, and it's not really so much a complaint as in like a very minor thing I noticed, is that it's probably not one of the more unique albums in this band's catalog. You know, it's not the most forward-thinking or experimental or anything like that. It kind of feels like this band doing what it does best for the most part, and you could definitely hear what you're hearing here on this project on previous releases from this group, some of which, like Autumn Eternal and Kentucky, I think are maybe a little bit better as far as being like whole projects go. But, you know, when a band has a unique sound like this one, I don't really feel like it's as big of a problem if they have a release like this every so often, which is just them doing their core sound excellently, because that's basically what this newest Panopticon release is. Panopticon doing its really unique take on black metal in the best way possible. Again, this isn't the most forward-thinking or revolutionary Panopticon release to date, but if you like this band and you like their sound, you are certainly going to like this album, at least to some extent, because it has everything that makes this artist great packed into its runtime. And if you've never listened to a Panopticon release before, this isn't a bad place to start, because again, you'll get fully exposed to everything that makes this artist great. And, you know, it's still a really great album. Again, not one of the most historically important, I feel like, in the long run or anything like that, but it's just a really fantastic listen. Give this one a chance if you like metal music, especially if you like black metal. Yeah, I cannot recommend it highly enough. Next up, I'm going to be talking about the newest release from Portal, Avow, or not the newest release, one of the two newest releases from them this year. I will be talking about the second record after this one, but yeah, this one here is a follow-up to 2018's Ion, a record that I felt like was really great, probably my favorite Portal record, or one of my favorite releases from this act. I really liked how the band was able to have their typical chaotic style of death metal on that thing, but with a kind of refined sound that was a bit different from some of the murkier production on some of the band's earlier work. Not that I dislike that murkier sound per se, but I felt like Ion was a nice little change of pace in some regards, while also keeping a lot of what I liked in this act prior to that. And this record here, it sees the band kind of moving back to some of that older production. This record sounds a bit murkier in terms of its production, and it sounds a bit nastier too. But through and through, it definitely still is a Portal record. You know, it's very dissonant, very noisy, very chaotic, extreme metal. The vocals are still that whispered style of shriek. It still has that very unique sound that Portal have made for themselves over the course of their career, and it definitely stands out because of that. However, I do feel like, at least compared to that last release from these guys, that this album is a bit less memorable in my opinion, mostly because, while yes, Portal's sound is pretty interesting, it doesn't really do that much interesting or new stuff here on this album in particular. You know, I don't really see much of a reason to return to this record over, say, their last record, or maybe some of the other older records that I happen to prefer when compared to this one. Overall, this just ends up being some pretty solid, kind of out there death metal. You know, it's decent. I wouldn't mind listening to it again. Is it something that I'm probably going to go out of my way to listen to again? Probably not, but it's pretty okay for what it is. I would definitely recommend it to fans of this band and fans of this style of very noisy, out there, extreme metal, because you will probably get at least some enjoyment from it. And as I just said before, the next project I'm going to be talking about is the second record that Portal dropped this year, Hagbulbia. This is a pretty big change of pace for the group, as this isn't a metal record, it's actually a noise record. And of course, as I kind of alluded to when talking about the last release from these guys a few moments ago, this is a band whose core sound tends to incorporate some pretty noisy elements into it, even if it is metal music through and through. But here on this release, it sees the group exploring that noise sound of the side of their sound a bit more, and just really focuses in on it. And I think it's a pretty interesting project as a result of that. Whereas I felt like Avow was maybe a bit too typical for the band, in my opinion, I think that this project here is quite refreshing and interesting because of the sound switch up here on this thing. And I think Portal overall do this style of noise pretty decently. I wouldn't consider myself a massive fan of noise music, at least not at this point in time, but I think that the band's take on it here on this thing is pretty interesting, because it certainly feels rooted in a lot of the noisier components that the band has utilized on previous releases of theirs. I like how the whispered shrieks, the really unique style of vocals that the band has always had, also make an appearance on this thing as well. It certainly feels like a noise record that's being made by this act in particular. I don't really feel like it's one that could have come out of somebody else. And if it did come out of somebody else, I would certainly think to myself, hey, this kind of has some Portal influence to it. And overall, I think it ends up being a bit of an interesting release in that regard. I think it is a more interesting record when compared to Avow. And I'm not sure if that's an unpopular opinion or not, but yeah, I just found this record to be a bit more interesting overall when compared to that one, mostly because of how different it is. Is it like the greatest release like ever from these guys or in this style of music? I don't think so. I think Portal still has other records in their catalog I'd rather return to. There's other noise records I've heard, even as someone who isn't all that familiar with the genre, that I'd rather return to over this one still. But this was a pretty decent listening experience in my opinion, especially because it was a change of pace. And if you like Portal and you have a bit of an open mind, I would certainly recommend checking this out as well. Whereas Avow was a bit more typical of the group, this is a bit more out there and experimental, and I think for the most part it pays off and it delivers for those wanting something a little bit different. Next up, I'm going to be talking about the Eat EP from Poppy. This is a project that I was kind of interested to see how it was going to play out, because her last full-length release, I Disagree, was a really interesting blend of pop music and metal, and this here is a release that continues to see Poppy exploring metal, but in a bit of a different context, because while I Disagree, like I said, was a nice melding of pop and metal to a pretty even extent, this here feels like Poppy is diving deeper into metal, almost a more aggressive metalcore-like sound at certain points on this thing. The pop elements are downplayed a lot more here, though they do still appear to some extent. I think that the sound that she takes here on this thing has potential to work really nicely with what she's capable of doing. However, I don't really think that the particular set of songs I ended up getting here on this EP really showcased that to the fullest extent. I was actually kind of disappointed with the tracks I ended up getting here for a few reasons. For one thing, I feel like a lot of the instrumentals here on this thing are kind of bland and generic, didn't really do all that much for me. Poppy's vocals at certain points on this thing, particularly during some of the more aggressive moments here on this project where she's trying to sound a bit more threatening with the shouting and the screaming, don't really work for me because she's overdoing it to some extent, it feels like, and it doesn't really come across as threatening or anything like that. It just sounds kind of overdone and a bit silly because of that. And it's not helped by the fact that some of the lyrics here on this project are also pretty silly too, and that when paired with the fact that some of the other lyrics here on this project, while attempting to tackle some real-world issues, don't really end up saying all that much super interesting because they're just a bit too broad, it leaves the lyrics here on this project just not really doing all that much for me. There are some parts to this EP that I think work to some extent. I think some of the poppier moments here on this thing actually still sound pretty okay for much of the same reasons I liked some of those moments on I Disagree. It's just that while I do enjoy some moments here on this thing, there's never a full track here that I end up enjoying from start to finish, just because there's always some lyrics or vocal delivery or instrumental on one of the tracks here that just ends up kind of ruining my enjoyment of the track, despite the fact that there's often some components to these songs that I do enjoy. And overall, I just did not really end up enjoying this EP as much because of it. I think the direction Poppy took here on this thing is an interesting one, a respectable one, and I think it's one that can work with what she's capable of doing as an artist. It just doesn't really feel like it came together quite as nicely as it could have on this particular set of songs. I kind of feel like this needed a little bit more time in the oven to really develop into something a bit more interesting. But yeah, I could certainly see this appealing a bit more to a different set of people. Maybe if you just don't really care that much about the lyrics and you don't really mind some of the overdone vocal deliveries and stuff like that, maybe you can find yourself getting into this a bit more than I did. But personally, I didn't really care for it. And with that said, that sums up all of the albums I wanted to talk about here in this video. There are still more albums and releases that I wanted to talk about in a video like this, in a catch-up review that I've already heard this year. But to keep this video from going on super long, I'm probably just gonna break it up, do these albums in this one video here, and then come back hopefully in a few weeks with the second catch-up review for projects I've already heard, and talk about a few more releases in that too. So yeah, definitely give a listen to some of the albums I've talked about here today that I said were really good. Even some of the ones that I didn't particularly care for here in this video, I still feel like had some interesting qualities to them that are worth checking out. So if any of the descriptions I gave, even for the ones that weren't exactly my personal favorites here in this list, happen to intrigue you, I would certainly recommend giving those projects a listen, because even if I didn't particularly care for them, you might, and it might be one of your favorites of the year or something like that. But yeah, overall, these were just my thoughts on these projects. If you happen to have heard any of these records and had your own thoughts on them that were maybe different than mine, feel free to leave your own opinions on these projects in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you also leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content, more album reviews, discussion videos, countdown lists, things of that sort. Again, thank you guys for watching this video, and stay golden.